Thanks, Colin. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting and also Aboriginal leaders in communities around the state where people are tuning in today and working. Colin's given a bit of an overview of the project, and I'm just going to give you a little bit more detail around that so you can understand the context of the work that we've done so far and why today is an exciting event to have people from the state come in and talk to us about the work that they've been doing, their experiences, so that we can just listen to those, maybe be challenged, maybe be confirmed in some of the things that we're already doing, and to have a dialogue around what else can we be doing in Western Australia. Okay, just a I'll keep going while that gets sorted. Just a self-care reminder, it's a very challenging topic. Talking about child sexual abuse is challenging, and talking about children that have harmful sexual behaviours or have maybe more extreme behaviours is really challenging. So please, self-care, if you need to leave the room at any time, please do so. As Colin said, this came out of the child safe work. So we had already been working alongside the Royal Commission looking at their child safe organisation strategy and building a strategy for Western Australia, which involved resources that are on the website and running of seminars. And in the discussion of the seminars, that's when you get to talk about what are the challenging issues for you in your organisations, and harmful sexual behaviours was a consistent topic. Although that was not always the language. People have a variety of terminology and language in this area. Key elements of the child safe work were to make sure that organisations and leaders have mechanisms for children and young people to raise concerns or complaints, that staff are well equipped to respond appropriately to any concerning behaviours of children and young people, and staff are also able to respond to any disclosures from a child, so that's harm from an adult or harm from another child or young person. The Commissioner also has a function around complaints, and we do receive a lot of calls from community members, and quite a number of those would be focused on this area. So we have a phone call from a parent who would say, it's happened to my child at a certain school, I've withdrawn her to create safety, I worry about kids in the school behind. So we're looking at the systemic issue as well. So what we did was to meet with agencies around the table and say, what are you already doing, where are your strengths in this area, and what do you think you need some assistance with. Then we did a survey mapping of service providers in Western Australia. We had 65 responses to that survey, and we just asked them what services were they providing, and what did they think were some of the barriers and challenges in terms of children and young people accessing services or receiving services in WA. What came across the survey too was the issue of terminology, and I know speakers will probably touch on this as well, but it's really important that we look at how we're talking about these behaviours in children and young people and how we avoid labelling them. The labels in themselves can be very damaging and can limit the child's view of themselves, and how, in fact, they go on to put positive behaviours back in their lives and to address the issues of concern for them. In terms of the data, Colin did mention a fabulous slide with kind of all the data sets sitting around in a circle that came from the Royal Commission that kind of explains why it's so hard for us to know what is the incidence. There's been no kind of incidence study around child sexual abuse in Australia, let alone this particular area. So we're relying on lots of different research, and the research indicates that between 30 and 60% of all child sexual abuse is actually as a result of another child or young person's behaviour. That's quite a staggering figure, 30 to 60%, depending on which study you look at. And in a recent study within the Royal Commission context, there was a study looking at institutional abuse and looking at police data. And for Western Australia, the percentage of reports to police involving a minor or a young person for an allegation of sexual abuse in an institution was 62%. So again, you can see that this is just an area we can't ignore. There are a lot of children and young people involved who have challenging behaviours and a lot who are being impacted by that. Right, the slides are going up on the web eventually, so you can see them through a lot. Well, so this is about where we're up to. So this is a continuum from the HAPIT document that kind of gives us some language around harmful sexual behaviours, and a lot of the research now is classifying the problematic, abusive and violent behaviours in those columns into that definition of harmful sexual behaviours. Okay, so what do children and young people say about this? This is a really tricky area and there's not a lot of research, but there are a couple of pieces that we can draw on to hear their voices about why they might not speak up about it. What we know about the data is that that's a staggering figure, but it also, there's a lot of underreporting. So what is the challenge for children and young people? That's the Rodda circles and all the different agencies that might get disclosures from children, but none of this data connects. So, and there's some quotes from children and young people up on the board while I'm reading some other text. This comes from a study from NSPCC in the UK, where children are calling a helpline to say, this is an issue for me and what can I do about it? The children in the study indicated that it was difficult for them to actually talk about this because they didn't know what it was. They were unsure what was appropriate and inappropriate behaviour, and then when the line was crossed, they didn't know whether or not they gave consent. They were drunk when the abuse took place. The abuse might have been carried out by a friend or a partner. It might have taken place online, and they blamed themselves for what had happened. Young people in the study were reluctant to tell anybody they had been harmed as they worried they wouldn't be taken seriously. They feared they would be blamed or bullied about what happened. They were frightened of what the other young person would do to them if they spoke out, and they didn't think it was serious enough to report. What we also know from the research is that children who are harmed by another child or young person close to their own age are likely to experience ongoing effects comparable to those who are assaulted by adults. Experiencing similar levels of anxiety and depression, they can also experience flashbacks, nightmares, and ongoing learning and behavioural difficulties. The Royal Commission heard that harmful sexual behaviours can also have ripple effects on families and communities. In the public hearings and in the private sessions, survivors, victims and their immediate families told commissioners about their shock, their grief and distress. The families of the child who has the harmful sexual behaviours will also be affected, and they have a lot of shame and a lot of stigma. The harmful sexual behaviours, of course, are also potentially damaging for children who display these behaviours. If not addressed, they can have lifelong consequences, but if addressed early and effectively, they have a high rate of resolution. So the earliest possible the earliest possible intervention is a key lesson for us all. It leads to the best rehabilitative outcomes for children and young people. Lots of research happening in this area. This is just some of the recent ones in the last 12 months. So a lot of them, if you haven't got access to them, please just email me if you're interested in any particular studies. Okay, one of the pieces of the work that the Royal Commission obviously did was to talk to governments about what are you already doing in this area. And you can see that in 2010, Copenhagen had identified this as a key issue for the nation in terms of service provision nationally and put it on its agenda. And the Royal Commission in 2017 has basically said to every state and territory and to the Australian government that there is a lot of work to do in this area. So this is where the work the Commissioner has fitted in terms of what we found in Western Australia. The was quite in tune with what the Royal Commission had found. There's been some recent progress in WA. There are multi-agency protocols for education options for young people with harmful sexual behaviours across agencies. It's a good bit of work, and agencies have been starting to meet to talk about the recommendations in this area across the Royal Commission to come up with state government response and some potential actions in that space. Colin's already spoken to some of the things that we found from the survey mapping in terms of lack of language definitions or frameworks, agencies not knowing how each other worked in the space, the data entry. They also varied in quality. Some agencies had well-developed approaches, perhaps more around disclosures of children and young people, and less well-developed approaches around identifying behaviours in the problematic phase. There was also a heavy reliance on private practitioners in Western Australia, and we had 24 private practitioners respond to the survey, and government agencies also said that where there were gaps in service provision or perceived lack of experience in their own agency, they would use private practitioners. That's a challenging slide for you, but there are the recommendations from Volume 10 of the Royal Commission, if you haven't seen them. Basically, they are to have a national strategy around this, not just child sexual abuse, but a specific focus on harmful sexual behaviours, timely expert assessment for children and young people with these behaviours, adequate funding of specialists and generalist services, clear referral pathways so that everybody knows how to get children and young people into these services, including family and community members who might be noticing things in the home and want to voluntarily find services. Implementation of principles of best practice in therapeutic interventions, strengthening the workforce and improving evaluation. Sorry, I just want to end on some more quotes from children and young people. This is an Australian study, actually, who asked children and young people who had harmful sexual behaviours, what did they think were the key things that might have stopped them developing those behaviours in the first place. Firstly, they talked about their sexuality education. They felt they should have learnt about sex, age-appropriate sexual behaviours and consent, safe and respectful relationships. Some of the boys in the study said it was really important to them who gave them any sexual education at school and how tuned in they would to that, be to that topic area. And we know that most of the curriculum around protective behaviours, sexuality or gender-based violence education doesn't specifically talk about sexual behaviours between children and young people. So it's an area that we can do more around. We also need to look at the education of parents who are giving those first key messages to their children. How are they discussing behaviours between children and young people, if at all? Or are they just talking about the myths, general myths and misconceptions around this topic? Oops, sorry. Secondly, children and young people said they need help to redress their victimisation experiences. They need supportive responses. So that we know children and young people who have experienced trauma, sexual abuse themselves, environments of family violence are very vulnerable to developing challenging behaviours and potentially harmful sexual behaviours. So we need to have a sensitive, responsive support system across the state to make sure that we are intervening early with children in those circumstances within their family context and within their community context. Thirdly, young people said they need help to manage their pornography use. The consumption of both violent and non-violent pornography by adults and young people has now been positively and significantly correlated with verbal and physical sexual aggression for both male and females, both young people and adults. This is some of the quotes from survey mapping, and these are professionals in the sector who are kind of echoing what the children and young people are saying if you look at them in terms of challenges in our service curriculum. We can see then why kids aren't getting things that they say that they need to stop developing harmful sexual behaviours. the only statewide child protection strategy that we have in WA that we could find through the survey mapping is the protective behaviours curriculum in the Education Department. And there's limited quality control and monitoring of that. There's no readily identified educational strategies for parents or community members or for professionals statewide. There are people who might cover a little bit of it in their training, like the mandatory reporting training that we're putting chopping in, but nothing really comprehensive. Most of our funded services and government responses in WA are primarily through the child protection system, whose focus is on children at risk concerns. We've got some challenges there. And according to the definitions in the Royal Commission, they kind of spelled out the difference between specialist service and general service for sexual abuse. We have those specialist services in Western Australia. I'm going to leave it there. I'm just going to put up Colin's recommendations. So he spoke to the documents on our website, and they are the service mapping document if you want to have a look at what people said statewide. It's an issues paper which the Australian Centre for Child Protection did for us, and they look at the continuum of responses in terms of services and prevention and intervention that's needed across the spectrum of the behaviours involved in this area. And then a discussion paper. So these 4 recommendations are in Colin's discussion paper. Really, we want to engage you in the conversation and to have your input in this project going forward. So if you've got any comment on the discussion paper, we'd love to hear it. But essentially, for Western Australia, the recommendations are that we do something and do something quickly, because this is a very prominent group of young people who are getting, in some cases, not many services, if any at all. That we improve community understanding and acceptance. That's from the children and young people, parents, professionals, community members in a variety of contexts that we've got in WA. Strategic cross-government approach is required, and Colin is meeting with a roundtable of senior executives of government this afternoon to start talking about that. And then, where's this going? Understanding the needs of children and young people themselves, so actually getting their feedback on what we're doing already, what we're not doing, and evaluating the services. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. And if anyone's done a presentation and your PowerPoints fail, you always know, oh God, what do I say now? But you did a fantastic job, Nat. And so thanks for setting the scene. Our first guest speaker today is Tolliday. Most of you have seen his CV because it was in the invitation to join us today, so I'm not going to go through that. But Dale comes to us with a wealth of experience, and I think we're better off to hear from Dale than myself. So please welcome Dale Tolliday.
Good morning. I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners and other people, and pay my respects to acknowledge the traditional owners, and respects to the elders past and present, and respects and anxiously looking forward to our next generation of elders of all our Aboriginal people. I've been asked to bring my greetings from the mobs that work with me down on the east. We have an Aboriginal workforce in our services, which I'm going to talk about how we've what our journey's been today, and those mobs are from the north, the west, the south, New South Wales, and into the mountain country of Victoria. Okay, so I've got these PowerPoints. Hopefully they'll be made available to people. I believe the PowerPoints are there to jog my memory, not to really inform you. I'm going to try and talk to them and make this as interesting as possible, and stick to time. Here we go. So, building a response, quite a daunting prospect, I think, and looking back on the 20 years since we established our services in the health system in New South Wales, we've tried to do a retrospective this year to look at how we went about doing this, and it's been quite a journey. one of the issues to be aware of is that there's a broad spectrum of behaviours and a broad spectrum of contexts from which young people come who engage in harming behaviours. And to pick young people's context at one end or other of the spectrum means you're going to miss a lot. And one of the great dangers is to really land on the high end of the spectrum because that doesn't define the vast majority. And if it's in people's minds that these young people present an enormous risk developing into adults, that's not the reality for the majority of these young people as well. But because these young people are engaging in harming behaviours right now, and they have children around them who've been victimised, affected by the abuse, and because the young people who are engaging in harmful behaviours have a high likelihood of having been traumatised in some way, and the behaviours themselves are developmentally interrupting for those young people, these are all the reasons for intervening strongly and effectively whilst these young people are still in their childhood or adolescence. So just a quick look at what happened over in New South Wales. And I should say that the first specialist program that's been acknowledged internationally for adolescents with these behaviours was only in 1976. That might sound like a long time ago to some people, but really it's not very long ago at all. In New South Wales, our Juvenile Justice Department established an adolescent program in 1990. By the mid-90s, a number of sources within the state identified a need to have services specifically for adolescents that weren't through juvenile justice. There were no specialist service providers able to be identified in New South Wales landscape. There were some private providers, but it's very hard to determine that they were specialists. And New South Wales Health had been developing and building itself as a service portal for all forms of child abuse, particularly child sexual abuse for children who'd been victimised. And so it was there was a developing sense that if services were able to be developed and delivered, they would be delivered through the New South Wales public health system. Part of the reason for doing this is that the kids that make it into the justice system are just a fraction of the kids that get reported or known. And the kids that get reported and known are a proportion of an unknown underbelly at the rate of incidence of harming behaviours. In New South Wales, we have a system of mandatory reporting and threshold levels within that. So it's a tri-agency group of health, police and statutory child protection agency. At least 850 young people aged between 10 and 17 are reported as people who caused harm to children in relation to harmful sexual behaviour per annum. And between 25 and 75, sometimes a little bit more of those young people will be managed within the justice system. So a small number, a small proportion. And one of the complexities involved in that statistic is that children at the young end of that spectrum at 10 are fairly unlikely to be able to be shown to have the requisite mental capacity. You know, the principle of Dolinka Pax is a play where the prosecution has to displace a presumption that a child between the ages of 10 and 14 has a capacity to recognise that their actions are seriously wrong. So we've got that, and then we've got the reality that we need to be careful of how we take on board what the Royal Commission has said. Though Volume 10 is very clear about children with harmful sexual behaviour. The majority of this is happening in private settings, in relational context, not in institutional context. There's a high rate in institutional context, but child sexual abuse is something that's not recognisable or visible. And in relation to the services that we developed in New South Wales Health, as we unpack those services and had a look at our young people, we've consistently had 50% of our young people coming to us because they've engaged in harmful behaviours towards a sibling. And then the next largest group is other closely related young people. And most of those sibling matters have occurred in their own homes, or if they've been co-placed in out-of-home care together. Another reason for New South Wales Health stepping into the space is the opportunity to integrate services across a broad spectrum, knowing that or finding that young people have got a broad range of those health-related issues to be attended to. They can access a broad range of services, and the services delivered to young people with these behaviours can be integrated with services for others. So the best example is sibling sexual abuse. So siblings are receiving specialist child sexual assault services, and siblings with harm are receiving a specialist health service within the same health portal. They should be able to have those service processes integrated. So a quick timeline, just to demonstrate a fairly high incidence of public processes that have led to funding services. So some of my more cynical moments, I've thought that we've been a solution to a problem of the day, and it's not a bad way to think about placing ourselves, because once we engage with this, we can see there's a broad scope. Our services aren't available across the whole of New South Wales, though in a stepwise way the services have been growing and being developed as they're proving value, as they're getting recognition and people are wanting to engage. So 1997, during the Wood Royal Commission into the alleged police protection of pedophiles, they've got a much broader base when it was moved from our Independent Commission Against Corruption into a Royal Commission. In the midst of that inquiry, the funding came for our first Near Street service. The first submission I wrote for an adolescent service was in 1991, 2 years into the operation of a treatment program for families where a parent is sexually harmed a child. We found, contrary to the justice-based evidence about those men, is that about 2/3 indicated to us that they had first sexually harmed a child when they were adolescents, and the person that they harmed was their sister or their cousin, or both, somebody very close to them. And so our initial glimpse of this was to think, okay, we need to get into this game at an earlier point in time as a preventive strategy, as well as attending to those issues in a timely way. Wind forward to 2007, or actually in 2006, we had the Aboriginal Child Sexual Assault Task Force, and the Children's Commission of the day, New South Wales, tapped me on the shoulder and said, you need to go and give evidence to the task force. And I just sort of pie-eyed said, what do you mean? Why are we doing that? She said, well, you started talking about trying to improve outcomes for working with Aboriginal kids and families. Go and tell them what you're doing. So I went with a colleague and pulled together as many stats as we could. Spent an afternoon with the task force, and when they wrote their report, they criticised us for an underrepresentation of Aboriginal children and young people, and then recommended that our services, the service board for which further investment should be made. So we got a smack and a pat on the back, and we got funding for our first rural service through that, and which was based originally in Tamworth, still based in Tamworth. Then in 2010, the New South Wales government expanded services for children looking at priority populations, making populations a priority, and expanded that rural service in Tamworth to include a Newcastle office. So that's the Hunter New England region that goes from Newcastle in a sort of a wedge right up to the Queensland border, missing Byron Bay and other eastern or northeastern parts of the state. It created an Office of Clinical Advisor, which is the position I feel. It's located in the Children's Hospital Network as a specialty clinical resource to the New Street services in the New South Wales health system about adolescents, children and adults. That office has just been enhanced again with an associate advisor. We have a specialist librarian and specialist technical support for the services. And we enhanced the Sydney service slightly in those 2010 Keep Them Safe initiatives. We fast forwarded again, 2012, we had a new government in New South Wales who took a decision which surprised us to close our adult treatment program. And then those funds were redirected for a New Street service in Illawarra, Shoalhaven, which became operational. It was funded in 2014, but there was some issues in translating that into a practice, so they opened their doors for business and started last year. And this year, the Murrumbidgee Health District, which covers the southwest of the state, a huge area of including Albury, Wagga, Hay, and across to the South Australian border and Victorian borders. That health district has decided to allocate and got permission to allocate its enhancement fundings to create a service. So this is the direction of the grow, and we are hoping that a part of New South Wales' response to the Royal Commission recommendations is to help us build more services. So on the one hand, I've been anxious to get more quickly, but on the other hand, I've felt very stretched and pressured, and I think it's quite a good stepwise progression. But what it means is we've still got patches of the state we're about to cover, and it means we've got one specialist service for the 7 health districts of the Greater Sydney area with, I think, a population of about 6 million, and Melbourne, by comparison, has more specialist services covering the city of Melbourne. So we've got those matters ahead of us. We've engaged in 3 levels of evaluations today. We had a 4th evaluation that failed. In the first 2 years, we had a qualitative and process evaluation by Professor Tony Vinson, which included him having permission to speak with young people, families, as well as staff and agencies and staff and partner agencies. So that was for us to check in if we're on the right track. Effectively, we had a specific Aussie experimental design evaluation in 2006, which we've reworked some of the data and republished in 2014, and we've got a further publication in press at the moment. And in 2014, KPMG conducted an evaluation. The failed evaluation that we had actually speaks to the issue of data and evaluation in this space, which is difficult. We set up a prospective longitudinal study, which required consent by our program entrants at the time of entry into the program, and we argued with our Privacy Commission that we wanted exemption from that. We felt that given the subject matter and the types of data that we were wanting to get over time, we wanted to provide a reassurance in some way that we would be managing people's privacy and preserving it. We, of course, would know who the people are because they're our customers, and we were wanting to tap into child protection, subsequent child protection data, vets and police data. We had permission from the agencies in principle, but the Human Research and Ethics said that we needed to get explicit consent. We couldn't get an exemption. As a result, 15% of our customers signed up, and 85% said they felt unable to commit themselves to that level of unknown future scrutiny. And we're not alone in that dilemma in this space of trying to set up a study. We did some mapping. This is just a number of the issues that you face if you're going to try and set up some sort of service. I mean, safety has to be the headline. How do you ensure safety? What does safety mean? How's it defined? Safety for whom? You know, of course, we've got safety for our staff. We've got safety for the young people that we're seeing, safety for the young people who they engage with either at home or at school or in other social environments. Supervision, organisational stuff, right down to how we set up the physical environments where we deliver our services so that we provide a secure and safe place. The most secure and safe place we're providing our services for, they're all on a similar design, but the Sydney service is on a campus of a former mental health institution in a former ward area that's got a large outdoor area, a group room, a lot of therapy spaces, but a buzzer at the front door. When our young people and families get into the building, they own the building in a way. They get to meet all of the staff. They feel very comfortable in the area. We're able to engage in a broad range of activity-based therapies as well as talking therapies, and all comment to us about the need for it to be a place where they feel it's discreet to get to, that they're not recognised on the outside, and once they get inside they feel like it's contained but not contained in rooms, because we've got a large fenced outdoor area which we can use for all sorts of activity-based stuff, and also for some of the work we do with some of our Aboriginal young people and their families. We work sitting out under the trees. Our organisation has a state-level multi-agency advisory committee that's got high-level participants across a number of agencies, including police, justice, statutory child protection, health, the peak body for children's child welfare associations, victim services, and representatives of each of our service organisations. We have performance targets set by the Ministry of Health for the local health district. We've changed those targets this year for the first time, reflecting some of the research. A key issue that's come out of the research is that the highest risk group for being harmed again or harming others again are young people who start or are entered into a treatment process that then do not complete it. So we've got other groups that we know are of high risk, but that is clearly the highest risk group. And in our evaluation, in 2006, we had 32% of our young people and families not complete the treatment process. Was that group? Internationally, in voluntary treatment, the rates on average for non-completion of a voluntary-based therapy of any kind is between 30 and 50%. For our population, 30% is unacceptable because of what is represented in that 30%. And so there's been debate internally about other people that don't finish treatment, are they different? Do we need to be doing something differently? What do we know about them, etc.? What we've reached with our service targets, we've set a target on all of our programs in terms of their performance. They need to have 90% or more complete their treatment. We've found that many of our service non-completers or dropouts don't drop out if we pursue them in a non-harassing way, and we do outreach and we engage with them and inquire. And we do it in a layered way. We'll work through the service managers. I'll go out to services. I'll go out and travel out to regional and remote areas and meet with a family if I have to. If that will help retain the engagement, we'll do whatever it takes. And that's an attitudinal thing as well as a performance-based thing to work with children and families. And if they impress on us that we need to change how we're working, we'll do that as well, because we want to actually go the journey with them for that purpose. Of the young people and families where there's dropout currently, the majority of those that don't complete are people who have got families who, for work-related issues, are migrating, for homelessness issues, are moving from one place to another. And we know the instability around household employment and security of housing are some of the underlying drivers of the instabilities that present some risk for young people. So we've got performance targets, we've got service guidelines. We're about to publish our service guidelines in 2 or 3 weeks. We're just waiting for our final sign-off and explicit standards of practice to work to. Our services have got a ethos statement, which is a publicly available statement of our principles of practice, our beliefs, and the targets we're working towards. We use it in several ways, not just with training and our staff and communicating, but we use it directly with the families who we engage with in the out-of-home care organisations and kids living in care. We have service level agreements that are formal between the Children's Hospital Network where I work and with the health corporations that provide the services. There are supervision contracts between the service coordinators and myself for their supervision. Each news street has a minimum staffing profile, which has a clinical coordinator, senior clinician, and 3 counsellors, one of which must be Aboriginal identified. So that's who we are and how we're kind of organised within our health trade. And in terms of what the evidence tells us about effectively working with this population, one of the pieces of work that I was involved with was this piece for the Royal Commission, which was a rapid evidence assessment. I told some folks yesterday that I wriggled and squirmed when I was invited to get into this. I was so desperate to do it, but I wasn't really keen on the terms of reference. But I agreed because I felt that we weren't going to turn up much evidence, and we didn't, because we were limited to random controlled trials and quasi-experimental designs. We had 3 target groups: children under 10, with problematic behaviours, children from 10 to 17 who weren't being managed in the justice system, and children 10 to 17 who are in the justice system. There were, it's an international review, rapid review, published grey literature, etc. There were two, most of the studies were old. That's on the next slide. There were two eligible studies for the under 10s, one for children 10 to 17, that was our New Street study, and 24 for children 10 to 17. And multi-systemic therapy studies were the strongest when we analysed them at that time. Subsequent analysis actually cast a bit of a shadow over the strength of the MST studies in relation to problematic sexual behaviour. The New Street evaluation, what we did was randomly draw 50 kids in the first cohort that we had, and 45 of whom were for girls, 5 for boys. Because we were oversubscribed with referrals, we were able to match 50 young people who we didn't see to those 50. So we're able to do whatever else happened versus what we did between the two groups. There was insufficient strength in the results to demonstrate a difference in terms of repeat harming. The base rates are low, our numbers were low. But we did find a marked difference between the completers and non-completers, which has led us to that other performance indicator I was just talking about, target that I was looking at. We saw very different profiles and outcomes for girls to boys. If I had another moment in the stage, I could just launch into that for you, that the profile and the service needs for the girls is quite distinct to the boys in our experience. Look, the headline with girls is that the trauma history is present for us in all of our girls, in all of them. In all but one girl, over the years that we've worked, they have polyvictimisation by poly-offenders, and the sexual victimisation has always been by men. Physical abuse, neglect has been by men and women, and some violence has been by women and men. Primarily parents, but it could be grandparents, uncles, aunts, or partners contained in that group. We also found uniquely, and this is the second paper we've got in press at the moment, there still hasn't been any international data on this, but the longer term outcomes, Simon Hackett did some work with looking at the lives of the young people who went through programs, 600 young people, and concluded that their lives have not been so great. Those are his words. So, there's a lot of markers, not really at the level that people would want them to be, not in settled relationships, not really engaged in employment and training, etc. in the same way. A whole lot of social indicators being below par. 90% of our girls in the follow-up period of 2 to 7 years were subject to subsequent harm, and that was registered, that was acknowledged through a confirmed report to our Child Protection Authority or a confirmed report to police. So it was 2 groups of 5, so it was all 5 of the comparison girls, 4 of our treatment group. 3 of the children out of 100 were seriously sexually assaulted. They were 3 of the 5 comparison group girls. It really spoke to us about the lives of the girls in the context and the need to actually attend in a much more future-focused as well as present-focused way to their immediate and future safety needs. The harm to the boys tended to be physical harm, but it was 69% of the boys had that same level. So the interesting thing is that once kids are identified as having harming behaviours, they tend to become ineligible for all range of other services. They tend to be focusing onto these specialist services. And the lens that people see them through is solely about the harming behaviour. And it comes as a surprise. I've done a presentation on this in a treatment forum where I called the presentation, apparently nobody cares about the well-being of kids once they've been identified for harming. And because that's my message to the treatment community. Like, if we're really in it, if we're saying we've now become really aware and focused on prior trauma and we're trauma informed, we attended that trauma, why aren't we attending prospectively to the well-being and safety of the children and young people so that we don't have that level of horrific future experience? The key research elements the key elements that the research of the Royal Commission showed that treatment programs need to have for young people who've engaged in harming behaviours, the programs need to have these things: holistic, ecosystemic, family and care focused, meaning engage with family, meaning not having parents coming along and having them as therapeutic allies or being told about the therapy that somebody's doing in a room with the child, meaning that there's primary therapeutic input for the parents, which is a different thing. Needs to be developmentally focused, coordinated multi-agency and partnership with families, and the young people need to have an individually assessed and unique therapeutic process with specialist approach to the harming behaviours. Features to avoid: a non-specialist response. There's no non-specialist response or program with mixed populations of children that's able to demonstrate effectiveness. It's as blunt as that. Engaging with young people, supporting them and reflecting with them on their own is insufficient. There's no data that that's going to work. That's very confronting to a person who's a trained therapist and they want to get into the room and start working therapeutically with a child. To be told, well, basically, if that's the extent of it all, you've really got limited gains that you've got to be able to achieve through that process. Manualised group-based programs, fortunately, I think are pretty well history, but we need to say they need to be avoided. Group programs that can produce peer contagion. So this is along the lines of, if you have a young person who's got a broad base of antisocial behaviours, including harming behaviours and some socially, some deficits or some things to learn about social competence and so on, why would you treat them in a group with 5 other young people with those things, compared with trying to promote access to pro-social and positive peers engaged in real community-based activities? The gains are more enduring and they're generally quicker. And don't aggregate kids based on sexual behaviours, particularly in out-of-home care. Aggregating kids, say, in a resi care setting based on their sexual behaviours, really you're most likely going to see a sexualising environment and getting some amplification of the behaviours. So kids, if they do need to be in group homes and resi cares, they can be streamed together and standards and procedures can be set up for it to be so. At the same time as the Royal Commission research project I was on, the National Institute of Care and Excellence in the UK that sets standards for health services was inquiring into the same subject area. But rather than looking at random controlled trials, they were looking at a qualitative synthesis, and they accessed 5,000 research articles and they reduced it down to 26. And they came up with the same set of recommendations of what needs to be in an effective service, which was, it relieved me of the anxiety I had about going into a research process that put us into a really small pond of eligible studies to say, well, here's another process that's been done in a like jurisdiction, not exactly the same, but the United Kingdom, and they've drawn the same stuff out. They didn't recommend the MST research, they noted it. They note one of the issues with MST, again, it's for another discussion at great length, it hasn't translated well. An MST PSB project in London has, in the last 12 months, failed to produce results that they anticipated. There are issues with the research design. It's not actually a true randomised capacity. So again, if I can speak at another time, or if anybody's interested about those issues, we need to have some care. The MST approach has been very strong in providing us with confirmation of a need for a holistic, family-focused response for children and young people, but it's missed some other elements that's come from the other part of the treatment field. And the MST research fundamentally has not attended to the full spectrum. Hasn't attended to kids at the top with highly complex, and it hasn't included the kids at the lower end. Not so worried about the lower end. I think there's a general level of counselling that can attend to kids at a lower end of engagement with these behaviours. Okay, these are the reasons of why specialist services are needed. There's fundamentally distinct knowledge and skill base. I'm going to skip over these because I want to get to the issue that I've been asked to look at, our development of our responses for Aboriginal children and communities, which is in a couple more slides. Okay. KPMG in 2014 compared the stats that we provided to the Aboriginal Child Sexual Assault Task Force in 2006 with where we'd reached by 2014, and our participation had increased by a factor of 7. So we're pretty pleased with that. It's not been a steady course, and it's taken a lot of stubbornness and persistence and a fair slate of courage by our workforce. So how have we done it? We have an Aboriginal clinicians network, so we have these identified Aboriginal positions. We have 8 at the moment, and we're about to recruit to our 9th position. They are a distinct network across the state. We meet face to face every 2 months. We've got a meeting tomorrow in Sydney. We relate to an organisation called the Aboriginal Communities Matter Advisory Group, and we use that as a reference group for looking at the cultural sensitivity and appropriateness of the protocols we're putting in place for working with our Aboriginal children and community. We have a upfront commitment to cultural safety for all. So that's for all of our staff, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, and all of our clients. We recognise the trauma caused by colonisation and the related practices that continue to have an impact on whether and how Aboriginal people can access our services. We have our workforce committed to culturally competent practice. That's been a process of at least 10 years that has engaged us in not only training, a review, but a review of all of our policies and procedures, a personal journey for all of our staff. And we've implemented amongst our protocols cultural consultation from our Aboriginal colleagues within our teams on an informal and a formal basis as part of our published guidelines of practice. We have an Aboriginal engagement plan as a requirement at every service in every location. That means engaging local services. In our Tamworth office, which was our first Aboriginal office, there are two non-Aboriginal staff in a multi-service office. So the New Street, it's their building, but they share it with out-of-home care and child sexual assault. There's a meeting room out the back that the local Aboriginal men's group use 2 nights a week, and we do some work together with them. And on Tuesdays, the local Aboriginal elders have that as their meeting place. So we've tried to actually embed ourselves. The local meeting place of the Aboriginal elders appears to be very strongly connected with a stronger engagement with health services of the local Aboriginal community. What's another example of what we've done from that office? We noted in one community high levels of crime in our collaboration with police in one of our 2 of our local communities in the far north of the state, and we had a moment of funding where we were able to identify when was that likely to happen, how was it happening. So it's happening typically at the end of the week, and it involved alcohol, boredom, isolation. Our service manager identified some young Aboriginal men who were putting together on their own resources an Aboriginal dance group telling traditional stories. They were supported to do this and present this. And then the strategy for those 2 communities was in collaboration with DC Pre-Citizens Youth Club to provide buses to the communities for whoever wanted to get on the bus on a Friday night to have the 1 and a bit hour ride into another centre. And we took the dance group up north to the dance centre where the kids and their families were fed, had a whole range of activities, including the cultural connection. The incidence of crime in those 2 communities on those nights was virtually near 0. The funding hasn't continued. There was an enduring aspect, but these things sort of wane. But it was an example of cross agencies, particularly police and health, which are agencies that don't normally get together over a community-based intervention, finding something that was a solution that involved engagement across 4 communities, actually. Okay, so we found with Aboriginal clients and communities, doing outreach is critical. And if we do outreach, one of our outreach circuits is a road trip of 1,600 kilometres. So that's probably familiar over here in the West from some of the places where people are working. The outreach produces high level of engagement and completion rates of our Aboriginal children and young people at the same rate as our non-Aboriginal clients. We do community-based programs in partnership with a health organisation called the Education Centre Against Violence, and these programs, the acronyms at the bottom of the page here are Weeding the Net, which is a community-based program on violence, abuse and neglect, SOAR, which is Strong Aboriginal Women, and SAM, which is Strong Aboriginal Men. And the men from our New Street services, including myself, are involved in the SAM projects around the state. Those projects really set the scene for communities to not only anticipate but demand services around sexual safety. The original recruitment of the workforce was slow, especially in attracting men to do this work, and we really had to white knuckle it and hold on to the funding and hold on. And we've now filled those positions. We've told the 2 men they're never allowed to leave until they retire. And we'd like to build more capacity behind them. And as our workforce actually started with 7 none having full professional qualifications, we've worked together with ECAB and University of Sydney to develop a training pathway. 7 have now got full professional qualifications, and the 8th is on the way. Again, we feel so proud of our workforce, and are learning as we go the high level of expectation their communities and families now place on them. And we're trying to work out ways to best support our colleagues. And one of our workforce this year, Julie Shelley, is absolutely amazing. She's our first Masters of Social Work graduate, and she's New South Wales Aboriginal Woman of the Year. And that's recognition for her work with the Forgotten Australians, stolen generations of which she is part. Her pathway now, her decision to work with in this area, which culturally is very challenging for Aboriginal women to be working around something that's predominantly without treatment behaviour by young boys and men. So that takes me to the end of my presentation pretty well on time, I think. So thank you for your time. I'm happy to chat more during the break.
Lisa Rodda is our next guest, and she's the Senior Program Advisor of the Victorian Department of Health and Human Services Victoria. And as does Dale and as Lesley-Anne herself, they've all given up a long weekend to be part of this. I took them yesterday, and I immediately whipped them out to dinner so that I could actually pick their brains. And while it was a very pleasant night, I'm sure they were just glad to get home and get to bed. But, so please welcome Lisa Rodda for her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's always really an exciting opportunity for me to talk about what we're doing in Victoria around supporting young people with harmful sexual behaviours. First, I just want to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land and to Aboriginal people here today. And I really just want to say thank you again to the Commissioner for inviting us. It's just a fabulous opportunity. So I hope today's presentation helps you understand how Victoria came to be where we are today, and these slides should be available as well. And that's my email address if people are wanting to ask any questions, because often information takes a while to filter up. So if you've got some questions 2, 3, 4 weeks later, whatever, feel free to email me. That's completely fine. So let's hope. So this is what we're going to talk about today. The context for change, why we came to where we are today, Victoria's definition of sexual behaviours, when is a child in need of therapeutic treatment, what particular provisions we have to support young people who have engaged in harmful sexual behaviours, the role of child protection, because they're very pivotal in actually being able to support children and families. We also have the Therapeutic Treatment Board, which is an independent board that provides advice to child protection regarding the suitability of therapeutic treatment orders. The role of SAVITs, now you'll hear me talk about SAVITs, and that stands for Sexually Abusive Behaviour Treatment Services. I also want to just touch on briefly about working with children checks, because I think that's really important. It's something that we all need to really consider, particularly when we're working with young kids who have engaged in harmful sexual behaviours, and that there is provisions in the Department of Justice and regulation legislation to have information about that if an adult who was a child is seeking a working with children check. So when I was a practitioner way back last century, in the 1990s, I was under the guise of the Children and Young Persons Act, and we really didn't have much of a mandate to intervene with families where children and young people were harming other children. We could certainly intervene when parents were doing the harming, but not when children were doing the harming. I think too at that time, young people engaged in harmful sexual behaviours, it was always deemed as a criminal issue, and that best be dealt with the criminal by the criminal justice system. There was a little focus paid on looking at how we can intervene with children and families from a therapeutic response. And certainly too, I do remember very clearly that any type of treatment was based on an adult sex offending model, not from where we are today. So in 2000, our Act underwent a review, and it was really to look at the issues around children languishing in out-of-home care and the episodic involvement of child protection coming in and out of children's lives, and children being subject to multiple placements, reunification case plans, all those sorts of things. But then it really provided an opportunity for all of our service systems to provide information to government about some of the issues that they were facing with. And in Victoria, we were very lucky because we had, a government who was willing to listen, but we also had an opposition that were willing to listen as well. And I think that was really important. We were able to get to where we are today. So it provided the opportunity to consult with a whole range of community organisations, including sexual assault centres, who were talking about their concern about adults that they were seeing, that they were disclosing that they had engaged in harmful sexual behaviours when they were young, or that children that they were seeing were disclosing that they were being harmed by an older child. Importantly too, Victoria colleagues highlighted the issue around not being able to pursue any criminal charges, and Dale spoke before about the dollar year for tax. So that was certainly an issue too, that even though they wanted to pursue a criminal investigation, pursue a criminal charge, it was unlikely that that child would be found guilty and unable to be referred to our MAPS program, which stands for the Male Adolescent Program for Positive Sexuality, and that's used to be run through the Department of Health and Human Services, but you've probably all heard about the youth issues, the youth crime escalating in Victoria. So now we have that program moved over to the Department of Justice and Regulation. Also too, and this is what Dale's also touched on as well, that children who were engaging in harmful sexual behaviours were usually engaging in a familial context, close family members, friends, or school peers. And a criminal justice response often placed families in that really difficult situation. What do I do? Force them to either choose one child's need over another child's need. And we're making any sort of therapeutic input very, very difficult and challenging. So we also looked at a whole range of research, and again we looked at sort of what was happening in the adult sex offender system, and some research saying to us that there were adult sex offenders who were disclosing that they commenced their behaviours in adolescence. I think too there was that lack of understanding that actually kids who were actually being harmed by children engaged in harmful sexual behaviours. I think that the line of thought back in the 1990s was it wasn't as bad as an adult harming a child, or that children will quickly forget about it because it was peer-to-peer, or that it was not as bad. And also too, we wanted to actually really look at how the harmful sexual behaviours put these children at risk developmentally. And we knew that if we put the right supports in place, that we would be able to encourage children to get back onto a good developmental track. So there was that growing recognition of a therapeutic response with a focus on child development, attachment and trauma, and inclusive of family. That was the most important thing. And we wanted to then look at how we can actually have a system that got people to understand that these behaviours place these kids at risk. So that's where I guess there was that sort of highlight, that golden nugget moment where we looked at moving it from a criminal justice response to a child protection response. So this is the definition that we use in Victoria around harmful sexual behaviours. I think it's pretty clear. I think most people probably have seen this version in various parts of their own working careers. And of course, too, I think we just need to know that the legal framework for children under 10 is different, because children under 10 can't be charged or given any sort of statutory therapeutic intervention in relation to the therapeutic treatment orders in Victoria. We have a different pathway for therapeutic responses for under 10s, and we call that problem sexual behaviour. So in 2005, but it didn't come into actually being progressed until 2007, we had the Children, Youth and Families Act. And here we have the Children, Youth and Families Act really trying to attempt a different way of looking and supporting kids and their families with harmful sexual behaviour. So we wanted to add to the system. We didn't want to replace it. We wanted to ensure that families were able to access treatment without the need for statutory intervention. And we wanted the statutory intervention to only occur with those really pointy-end families that we all had experienced in our working careers. But we also wanted to ensure that there was a criminal justice response if that was required. There's certainly too, and I think some of the concerns around the therapeutic treatment order system is that victims are often left out, that if they want to pursue a criminal justice response, do they have capacity to do that? And of course they do, because Victoria Police have their own charter, the Victims' Charter, where they must actually listen to what the victims are wanting and pursue a criminal investigation if that's what the victim wants to do. So we've touched a little bit on language, and I think too what I really wanted to stress as well is that the language that we use in Victoria is around harmful sexual behaviours, problem sexual behaviours. We move away from labelling the child as a perpetrator, as a sex offender, as a sex fiend, as some of our headlines have perpetrated in the past. But we wanted to really ensure that it was actually focused on child development, that we're looking at kids who are moving through adolescence, developing their identity in society, their self-esteem, and to enable the behaviours to sit apart from that young person. And we didn't want them to absorb that sort of labelling behaviour. Certainly too, with some families, I think, where there is like a bit of a pattern in history of adults in their lives committing sexual harm, that there is that sort of default to thinking that you're a born perpetrator, and we know that that's not true. So this is what we have in our Children, Youth and Families Act. We have two parts to our legislation. We have the criminal division and we have the family division side. And what's unique about our therapeutic treatment order legislation is all of this happens in the family division of the Children's Court, not so much the criminal division. The criminal division certainly have capacity to make a report to child protection if a young person has been brought before them with criminal charges around a sexual assault. They can ask the Secretary, the Child Protection Department, to investigate the suitability of the therapeutic treatment order. But certainly, I guess the reason why we have in the family division is that recognition that a therapeutic response is required, and that it does require a whole of family approach or caregiver approach to enable that young person to receive treatment. So our legislation is that this is when a child is in need of therapeutic treatment, when they are above the age of 10 and under the age of 15 years, and that they have exhibited sexually abusive behaviours. And child protection can receive a report from any member of the community, Victoria Police, or as I said before, from the criminal division of the Children's Court. for many reports that the department receives, that child protection receives, there often isn't any police involvement, and there doesn't need to be any police involvement. And I think that sort of gives families a sense of comfort, a sense of being able to be able to engage in a system, knowing that the police may not need to pursue any criminal charges if that's how it should be. So we have a lot of provisions in our legislation. You're very welcome to go onto our BigGov website and read it if you've got some spare time. Friday afternoons with a glass of wine is always good. So the Family Division, part of the Act, provides the role and remit for child protection to respond to reports about sexually abusive behaviours and harmful behaviours. This is what the other unique system that we have in child protection, that any report received about a child with harmful sexual behaviours must be investigated by child protection. It has to go through to a team that will actually work and talk to the young person about what's occurred, talk to the family about what's occurred, and then work through what is the best therapeutic approach for treatment. As I said, the orders are made in the Family Division of the Children's Court, and that only occurs when the magistrate in the court is satisfied that the sexually abusive behaviours have occurred, that the order is necessary to ensure the child has access to or attendance an appropriate therapeutic treatment program. The reason why I'm using the word sexually abusive here is that that's how it's written in our legislation. Importantly too, if a child is accessing treatment either in a voluntary capacity or under a therapeutic treatment order, if they make a statement that they're continuing to harm other children or that they've, disclosed previous harmful behaviours, that the police actually can't use that information to pursue or to be used in a criminal court setting if it ever goes to trial. And that's designed to really enable children to be free and upfront about their range of behaviours that they've engaged in. It's not meant to deny victims their opportunity to go to court, because child protection still must inform Victoria Police if there's a disclosure of harm. But it's really just to try and set a scene where children and their families can be freed up to talk through some of the most difficult things that they've probably ever had to experience. We also have capacity to place children on therapeutic treatment placement orders, and that's placing kids away from the family home. And that's really in circumstances where child protection have assessed that safety can't be guaranteed with a safety plan. Particularly if you've got the victims within the family home as well, and you don't want to be removing the victim from the family home. It might be best to actually remove the young person with behaviours away, and that might be in our out-of-home care system. It could also be with kid or kid. It really just depends on what is the best interest for that young person. There are circumstances where we do remove young children from their family and place them on a placement order because the families don't have the capacity to really support that young person's treatment during the therapeutic treatment order. And we know that 1 hour of therapy to 2 hours a week is great, but we also need the whole family and that young person's system to be on board to really fully support that young person to move through the therapeutic treatment order. So, as I said, we do have the criminal division of the Children's Court that also does provide some overview around kids who have been charged with a sexual offence, but the criminal division have referred it off to the department, to child protection, to assess the suitability of a therapeutic treatment order. So if the child has been on a therapeutic treatment order, or even if they're engaged in treatment voluntarily, those criminal charges can be dismissed at the end of treatment, and that's when the court's satisfied that the child has attended and participated in treatment. Again, it's really trying to actually acknowledge where that child is in their developmental pathway and enabling them to get a fresh start, to move through and not have this, huge thing hang over their head for the rest of their lives. So the role of child protection once we receive a report is to look at talking to the parents or to the carers around what is their response to the behaviours. Does the child pose any risk to other kids? Particularly if we're thinking about kids already in our out-of-home care system, we need to be really mindful of that. What are the natures of the behaviour? We saw Natalie's chart before around that continuum. Where do they best fit on that? Because, you know, coercion can be used, there is the abusive nature of some of the behaviours, but there's also trickery, bribes and all those sorts of things that need to be taken into consideration when assessing the harmful behaviours. And as I said before, when kids are residing in out-of-home care, we need to focus on how appropriate it is for them to remain there or to be placed outside, particularly if you have, and I'm sure this is probably not Victoria's unique experience, but where you have older children in a residential care unit who might be vulnerable too as well, just because a young person who has engaged in sexually harmful behaviours doesn't mean that they don't pose a risk to an older child in a residential care placement. So child protection work very closely with our service agencies. So Victoria funds 12 services across Victoria to provide the therapeutic component of the program. And child protection have to monitor that therapeutic treatment order just as they would with any other type of protection order through the Children's Court. So that's regular meetings, it's correspondence, it's being able to sort of be that statutory intervener and let the therapeutic service do their job, and that is engage with the family therapeutically. Some of the issues that we do come across is where the families do disengage in treatment, and child protection will, ask the service provider to keep calling the family, trying to make them engage, and we know that that really impacts on the ongoing therapeutic relationship, and that's really the role of child protection to intervene where they need to. So the service will assess and develop a therapeutic treatment plan with the whole family. They'll provide that ongoing therapeutic treatment for life for the therapeutic treatment order, and they always invite children and families to come back if they need a top-up, as they say. So there's always that open door, which is a really, really positive and unique thing. And Victoria funds, the way they're funded is to provide up to 2 years of treatment, therapeutic treatment for children and families. And we know that some kids might need 2 years, some might need 12 months, some might need 6 months, some might need 3 months. But it is funded to understand that kids often move in and out and need to sort of re-engage as well with the therapeutic program. So as I said, we fund 12 therapeutic programs across Victoria. Victoria, again, I think because it's a small state, we're quite concentrated. I've got heaps of time left, so that's good. We're able to be quite generous with the way that we fund. Our furthest service is maybe a 6-hour drive from Melbourne, so I know WA doesn't have that luxury like that we do. The Sabbats work with the children, their families and their carers, the school and the community service to provide an assessment and developmentally appropriate response. That includes talking to schools if they need to. And that's a really, really critical point to make, that schools are often having to manage these kids, and if they're not provided with information, not provided with adequate support to work with these kids, then often you get some pretty poor outcomes. And we certainly don't want our kids to be excluded from school. And I think part of the role of the Sabbats, as well as child protection, is to really help schools navigate that, because they're faced with a whole range of other issues, such as other families finding out, risk to other children, how they manage and support a child in education, not wanting to exclude that child from that education from their school. So there's a whole raft of things that need to be considered that Sabbats and child protection try and work really closely with to help them get to a point of a really supportive therapeutic plan for that child. So as I said, SABITs, they're funded to provide a therapeutic treatment for children under the age of 18, and their families for up to 24 months, and there's that open invitation. At the moment, as I was saying, child protection sort of work with kids from under 10 to under 15. That's where our legislation sits at the moment. And part of the rationale for that way back when the legislation or that provision was first developed was the concern that child protection were going to be inundated with numerous reports and that the child protection system weren't able to cope with that. There was also concern as well regarding the 15 to 17-year-old group. Were they more culpable of their behaviours? Do they best fit with our child protection system? And I think, as we sort of try to embed the therapeutic treatment order legislation within our child protection program, it was probably a good thing to look at it in a bit of a staged approach with the 10 to under 15-year-olds. Get that, work through first, make sure that we've got a good system that's accountable to everybody, and then look at the older age group. But again, age doesn't necessarily make the issues hard. We have to really think about where the abusive behaviours fit on that continuum. And there might be some kids who are age 12 who have engaged in very high-end behaviours, who are met with a whole range of challenges, and you need to consider whether they're going to be appropriate for a therapeutic treatment order program where that child is supported from a community perspective, like they're still at home or they're outside the home, but they're not certainly incarcerated. So the other unique system, and I think this is about trying to provide that independent oversight as well as some community assurances that kids with harmful sexual behaviours are being monitored in a particular way. And I think Victoria's come a long way in how we understand harmful sexual behaviours as well, and we're getting to a good position now, but it's taken a long time. So we have provisions in our Children, Youth and Families Act that we have established an independent therapeutic treatment board, that one of their roles is to evaluate therapeutic services and provide that information to the Minister, but their main role is to provide advice to child protection regarding the suitability of a therapeutic treatment order. So we have 16 representatives. We have 4 each from Victoria Police, Public Prosecutions, Health Services, and from the Department of Health and Human Services. All these appointments are made by their government council, and board members aren't paid for their time, so it's sort of like part of their responsibilities in their day-to-day job. So we have the 4 committees that meet regularly when child protection receive a report around a kid with sexually harmful behaviours, and they must provide a very, very long, extensive therapeutic treatment referral report to the therapeutic treatment board. The board don't meet the families, they don't meet the children, they don't often meet the child protection staff who is doing the referral. It's an independent board. But it's, the functions are managed by a secretariat within the Department of Health and Human Services. So they're really there because of their expertise in prosecuting sex offences, therapeutic responses for children with harmful sexual behaviours, a criminal investigation, so that's what Victorian Police would provide information on, and the child protection DHHS representatives will provide that child protection response. So typically when a referral comes through from child protection, it looks at who the family are. Has there been previous child protection history? Has there been previous issues of harmful sexual behaviours? If so, how was that managed? What are the family's responses to it? What are the child's responses to it? And quite often, we do expect child protection to interview the young person with the behaviours over a period of time, maybe 3 or 4 sessions. And, that young person needs to, figure it out first. If I disclose everything, what's going to happen? Is everything that my mum and dad said about me going to come true, that I am a monster, that I am horrible? That sense of shame for the parents as well, thinking that this is what's happened in their family, their sense of shame, wanting to do the right thing but not sure how to do it and how much to disclose. So it's about being very sensitive and understanding that if there is, levels of denial, what's the context for that, and not sort of just, being very simplistic about it and thinking, well, they're denying it, so therefore they can't have treatment this way. Denial works well for many kids, and we have to really understand and support that and help them through that process. And our Sabbath providers are very good at working with what they call that level of resistance and moving them to a position of being able to address the harm caused. So with the prosecution of sex offences, our public prosecutors will come in and look at their referral and begin to articulate to child protection why it won't ever be prosecuted in the criminal justice system, and that's usually because the victim is very, very young and isn't able to give reliable evidence, as they say, or that the young person, because of issues of dolly impact. So it's really their design to provide that very robust decision-making process and mechanism for them to articulate back to child protection. Yes, we think a therapeutic treatment order is appropriate for this young person, or we think that voluntary engagement is appropriate because the family or carers have certainly demonstrated that capacity to do that. Or they might say, actually, there's no capacity within this system to support this young person via a therapeutic treatment order. And we would suggest that the matter go to the criminal division of the Children's Court. But the issue with that is that you're really rolling the dice. So because, of course, the courts are independent, they make their own decisions about how things are done, and that can't be influenced by a recommendation from the therapeutic treatment board. So they would often default to a therapeutic treatment order because they know some of the challenges within that system. So in their deliberations, this is what they focus on. Have the sexually abusive behaviours occurred? What's the evidence to support that? And we might have for them the police briefings, the authorised brief or the unauthorised brief, witness statements, those sorts of things. Is the family able to provide a therapeutic environment for that young person? And as I was saying before, that's really, really important because you can't expect a child to navigate themselves through therapy without that support of family or from their caregivers. We've had instances in the past where we've had 14-year-olds expected to turn up to treatment by themselves, and that's impossible. So the message that we give to families, we give to carers, we give to child protection staff is that you need to go into their waiting room, wait for them to come out, be available if you're needed. It's really important. It's not like dropping them off at football practice or soccer practice. You've got to be in the moment with them. Does the family actually understand the seriousness of it? Where do they fit? Where are they in that continuum of understanding what's occurred? Because if you have that minimisation, you need to be able to contextualise why that is, and is that going to impact on the therapeutic services? What's the best pathway for treatment to reduce the risk of the child re-engaging in the behaviours? Trying to understand that, and we do know that some kids will, re-engage. So what's the environment for that? How has that occurred? And of course, I guess at the end, advice to child protection only. If child protection decides to act contrary to that, then they're well within their rights to do that. So the working with children checks, this is really complex as we're finding out now as our kids are moving through our child protection system and coming to our board and applying for a working with children certificate or a card. So this is the advice that we have, and I would probably recommend that you guys really think through how you manage this and how you talk to families about it, because there's certainly we do have to provide information to the Department of Justice regarding the therapeutic intervention. And when we first started thinking about this, I think I just really overreacted. Oh, how did they have this information? They're not going to understand it. And yeah, they didn't understand it. And that meant going out to the Department of Justice and Regulation and talking to people who really were used to denying cards to adult sex offenders, and to get them to understand why kids engage in harmful sexual behaviours and being able to put a bit of a different spin on it. So that is really important, to actually get in touch with your other stakeholders that might actually have an impact on the young person further down the track. So at the end of the day, we do provide information to them, and as far as I know, maybe for the 3 or 4 kids who are now adults who have applied for a working with children card have received one, and that's because of the information available. And that's the important thing for child protection staff to really get and understand, that when they're writing their case notes, when they're writing their case closure summaries, that they articulate very clearly what the therapeutic treatment regime was, had the child re-engaged in behaviours during that time, what are the support elements to keep this child, being able to work through their issues and not re-engage in the behaviours. Because we have had circumstances in the past where, as back when the provisions first commenced 2007, this kid was 14, very serious charges of sexual offending against his siblings. So he was 19, I think, and he reported a crime against himself. Victoria Police did a leak data check, as they do on their system, and realised that he had all these charges against him when he was 14 years of age, knew that he was living with a woman with a young child, contacted Child Protection. Child Protection didn't review any of the case files and went out there at 2 o'clock in the morning and removed this young man from the house, saying that he was a sex offender, all this sort of stuff. And it's all this because this young man had reported a crime against himself. What it really showed for Child Protection was that there was a real loop, that real sort of information gap to Victoria Police, also as well as on the Child Protection file, that information should have been written in there saying that there's been no further issues, everyone's satisfied, that treatment's been completed, the risk is at this point and this is why. So it was about developing that information loop back to Victoria Police so that they could also record that information on their database as well, so that everybody is in the know and that there's none of those sorts of awful consequences, which left this poor young man feeling quite suicidal and wondering whether this was always going to hang over his head, and that's certainly not what we want to do. So this is my last slide, and this is my good news story, because I've been working in this field in the therapeutic treatment land for 10 years, and I've always been wanting to advocate for the provisions to apply to the 15 to 17-year-olds. So we had our Royal Commission into Family Violence 2 years ago, and they made 227 recommendations, of which the Victorian Government accepted. Lucky us, recommendation 33 and 34 was around enabling our therapeutic treatment system to be expanded to enable young people aged 15 to 17 years to access therapeutic treatment services. So in Victoria, we already had 3 services who actually provided therapeutic treatment for young people aged 15 to 17, but now that's broadened to the whole 12 services across Victoria. And we're currently, in fact last week, the legislation entered into Parliament and now start to progress through the upper and the lower house to amend our Children and Family Act to enable therapeutic treatment orders to be applicable to the 15 to 17-year-old group, which is a great thing, which I'm really pleased to be able to be a part of that. The interesting thing though is that, and if there's any child protection practitioners here, I don't know what your legislation is, but our legislation is, the definition of a child is 0 to under 17. So we have these provisions from 15 to 17 inclusive. So that means that the Secretary or Child Protection is able to receive a report on a child who's aged 17 or under 18 in relation to their harmful sexual behaviours and be placed on a therapeutic treatment order for 12 months and possibly for another 12 months, because they can be extended at the end of the 12 months. Some of the things to consider is what happens if you're placed a young person on a therapeutic treatment order and they don't engage. What do you do? Well, aside from employing all your wonderful social work skills, your advocacy, doing your outreach, doing everything you possibly can, the only really left, the only avenue left for child protection is to revoke that therapeutic treatment order. And if there are criminal charges that have been set aside during the therapeutic treatment order period, then those criminal charges must be relisted, reheard, and the magistrate must make a decision about that. So that might mean that that young person might get a finding of guilt and may go off to the MAPS program. But maybe the 6 revocations we've had in the 10 years, one of them was only to do with the child who wasn't able to engage in therapeutic treatment. The other revocations were because they didn't need the 12 months of treatment, which can only be a good thing. And that's about it, I think. Yep, that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And how timely is that, given that the changes to the Department of Communities? I mean, there's so much we can learn from Victoria, I'm sure they can learn from us, but it's a real opportunity for us to actually pick up some of the learnings from Victoria and actually embed it into our future work. So for those who are sitting here from the Department of Communities, hopefully you'll take that back to your agency and see how we can start to build a better process for young people. So thanks very much, Lisa, for all of your contribution. Our third and final speaker, or fourth and final speaker, given Natalie will open it up for us, is Dr. Lesley-Anne Ey, lecturer in child development, educational psychology and child protection from the University of South Australia. Can you please welcome Lesley-Anne?
Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I just wanted to open with this picture. I wanted to have a look at that drawing. It's drawn by a child of 7 years of age. What do you notice about that drawing? Sorry? Unhappy faces? Anything else?
The tree.
The tree? Something going in the mouth. This was a 7-year-old child who had been sexually abused. It was this drawing that generated the disclosure. Quite often, if you're a teacher, you see a bright, colourful drawing like this one. Not necessarily easy to pick some of the indicators that a child has been exposed to sexual conduct. Okay. Now, I'd just like to begin with the findings from the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. So this is the Western Australian data. We had, between 2008 and 2013, there were 4,803 recent allegations of child sexual abuse reported to the Western Australian Police. Recent allegations means that they were allegations that were occurred within 5 years of the report. So this is an average of 961 allegations per year, which means that there's 2.61 allegations reported per day. Before I go any further, I also want to have a look at the diversity of language when we're talking about children with problem sexual behaviours. There's significant debate about how to describe children and young people displaying sexualised behaviour without labelling them as sex offenders. Some of the difficulties in defining such behaviour are compounded by a general lack of knowledge of child sexuality. Applying the term harmful sexual behaviour or problematic sexual behaviour avoids labelling children as sexual offenders. And as you will see throughout my presentation, there will be lots of labels where authors have positioned children as molesters or sexual offenders or sexual assault. What also doesn't help is in Australia, children can be held criminally responsible for sexual assault from the age of 10 years of age. So this suggests that from 10 years of age, children are making an informed decision to sexually assault somebody else. It's extremely rare that children under the age of 15 are prosecuted, but nevertheless, it's in place. Sexually abusive behaviours involve coercive and force, or coercion and force, whereas harmful or problematic sexual behaviours that affect individual development could include, for example, compulsive masturbation or addiction to online pornography. So your problematic and harmful sexual behaviours are commonly considered in some areas as non-physical. Nevertheless, such behaviours may result in stigmatisation and victimisation, as well as making others feel uncomfortable or impacting others in traumatic ways. So research suggests that there's growing evidence that child sexual abuse is perpetrated by other children and young people. This is why I wanted to get the language out of the way initially, because this is how it's written up in the research. From 2008 through to 2016, research found that sexual assault and related offences increased by 52% by children aged between 10 to 17 years. The non-assaultive sexual offences increased from 243 to 823 offenders. So the non-assaultive offences of a sexual nature or intent thereof against a person under the age of 16 years involves the presence of that person but not contact with that person. So the heavy increase is commonly non-physical sexual conduct. The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse in Western Australia, the data in Western Australia found that for the period of the 1st of July 2008 to 13th of June 2013, there were 267 recent allegations of child sexual abuse that occurred in an institutional location. And 6% of those, 82% of those occurred in a school context. So that means, given the children go to school 40 weeks a year, there was one case reported every third school day. And 62% of those reports were children's harmful sexual behaviours. So this was quite a surprise. They were generally expecting this to be adults perpetrating young children, and finding that children were displaying more harmful sexual behaviours than they were at risk of adults. Now, as we know, teachers with children 40 weeks a year and probably with them for half of their awake time on a daily basis. So therefore, school personnel are quite active. They're positioned very well to identify child abuse and child neglect. So it's not surprising to see that 20% of reports of child abuse and neglect come from educators. There's not very many studies in relation to children's harmful sexual behaviours in schools, looking at it from a teacher's perspective and looking at schools specifically. There's a dearth of information studies conducted between 1995 and 2016. I've only been able to find 6. There's several studies looking at children who are in therapy and children living in residential settings, but there's very little in relation to looking at children in educational institutions. Of those, there's only one Australian study. Nevertheless, all of them found that children were displaying sexual behaviour in educational settings. And the behaviours ranged from mainly mild sexual behaviour to more severe displays of sexual behaviour. The Australian study that was done by a colleague and myself, whereas we gave enlisted teachers online. We went through some teachers' associations. We didn't get much result, so we went through Facebook and paid money for keywords. It was an online survey consisting of 29 questions. The first few questions were demographic data relating to their teaching career, so what their position was, how long they've been teaching, what class level or year level that they were teaching, etc. We then explored their understanding of typical and harmful sexual behaviour, so asking questions around can you define what is typical sexual development for the age group that you're working with, and what do you think might be classified harmful sexual behaviour. We looked for details of their experiences with children's displays of harmful sexual behaviour and their responses. So we asked teachers if they have seen children displaying harmful sexual behaviour in the school setting, and how did they respond to that. We also asked them to describe what they had seen. We finally asked them what their training was in relation to identifying and understanding children's harmful sexual behaviour, the supports available in their settings, and what they think that they need to better support themselves and children. So it was only a small study. There was 107 educators from preschool, primary school and after school hours care. And there were only 11 from Western Australia. Nevertheless, all states and territories were represented, even though it cannot be, the findings can't be generalised because it's too small a group. There were certainly responses from every state and territory, which indicates that it's occurring everywhere. Okay, so 40% of the educators observed children displaying sexual behaviour. Some of the comments, I've taken some from teachers who were working with upper primary children, sort of middle primary children, and then early childhood. So these are direct quotes. We had a 13-year-old girl offering blowjobs to boys in exchange for cigarettes. One teacher overheard an in-depth explanation of what a 12-year-old girl went through the first time she had sex with her 19-year-old boyfriend. So that was, the child was in the backseat of the school bus on the way home from excursion when she was telling her friend. Genital kissing between a 15-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl may or may not seem problematic, but it certainly is in a school setting. A student trying to blackmail another student into sending sexually explicit photos or show body parts. So that was a 12-year-old boy trying to coerce a 12-year-old girl. A 12-year-old male removing his clothes and masturbating an 11-year-old male in a school setting. A grade 6 female student had been sexually abused in a prior situation, and then whilst at school placed other students in situations where they felt pressured to say and do things that were sexually inappropriate. So the behaviours included written letters, sexually explicit descriptions, changing of online profiles to penises, and asking another student to touch the student in a sexual way. And year 6 boys sharing pornographic material on his phone with others. Pornographic material, some don't see that as severe problem sexual behaviour, but the research demonstrates that it has quite a negative impact on children's developing sexuality. So it's very problematic, and particularly for year 6 child, but also for children in high school. In the mid-primary, we've seen a 3-year-old male threatening to verbally, and I'll let you read that means, if a friend did not comply. This child also engaged in rubbing his genitals, rubbing peers' genitals, discussion relating to sexual behaviour such as pornography, and he was also engaging in simulated intercourse. A 10-year-old boy displayed his penis to his friends, showing them the drawings his 11-year-old sister had done the night before, which I pondered over this one, wondering exactly what this means. So does this mean that the 11-year-old sister had drawn over his penis the night before? Did his 11-year-old sister draw his penis the night before? It's not very clear, and unfortunately in a survey situation you can't follow that up. However, still very problematic. A Year 4 student tries to coerce younger siblings into the toilet area so that she can touch them. This is not uncommon. The highest place for problem sexual behaviours in a school setting occurs in the toilet because they have that privacy. There's concerns around teachers being in toilets with students on their own. So there's ample opportunity for students to utilise that space if they're wanting to engage in problem sexual behaviour. A Year 4 girl has been approaching other kids and talking about sex and gave someone a note asking him to have sex with her. So this child was sent home from school camp for this, and the teacher who had written this extended this story, saying that this child is now grade 5 and still talks about that incident. What was very surprising, though, was the number of problem and harmful sexual behaviours displayed by very young children. So looking at the early childhood sector, I could have filled 3 or 4 slides with some of the quotes that I was receiving, which to me indicates that we need to start working with children very, very young and very early. We had 2 boys in Year 1 to 2 putting their genitals in each other's mouths. So this wasn't observed by the teacher, but it was reported. At prep to 2, child sexual play and simulated intercourse. The 6-year-old child pulling down another boy's pants and touching his penis. 3 girls touching each other, all aged 6, all because one of them had seen it on TV the night before when she couldn't sleep and turned the TV on. So that suggests that she has seen something inappropriate on television late at night and then reenacted those behaviours in the school setting. A Year 1 girl coercing other students into the toilets to remove the underwear. This young girl is a repeat offender. So this is some of the terminology that we're picking up from the media, from the newspapers, labelling the child and not the behaviour. A Year 2 boy continually exposing himself and trying to get other boys to do the same in secret spots. A Year 2 female student getting boys to kiss her and touch her under her clothing. And a 6-year-old girl told a 7-year-old boy that she would sex him when he came over to her house and that she has a secret closet at home where they could do it. So this was also extended in the explanation online or on in the survey. This 7-year-old boy was best friends with this young girl's brother, and this boy reported to a teacher because he didn't want to go over to his best friend's house anymore because he didn't know how to manage that. Then we've got some that where the age wasn't clear, but nevertheless demonstrates coercion or threats. So a student threatening to rape another student and tackling them to the ground. Also lots of pulling down of own pants, lots of obsession with sex, porn and sexual language. Boys were in the toilet when one asked, "Do you want to have sex?" Then continued to demonstrate with him, "This is what you do." 2 boys asking a girl to expose herself to them, and they were exposing themselves to her, telling her that they won't be her friend because she doesn't comply, but also touching her inappropriately. And then touching other students and hiding to show and touch, the show and tell touching. Most of these behaviours suggest that there are underlying issues such as sexual abuse in the background. Now, although the majority of teachers were able to identify quite accurately problematic sexual behaviours versus normally or typically developing, we did have some teachers that overestimated what was problematic. So we had a year 6 male student drawing penises over someone else's work. So to me, that's socially inappropriate sexual behaviour, but it doesn't necessarily suggest sexual abuse or inappropriate sexual behaviour. A year 3 male simulating masturbation during a dance performance in front of parents. I think he's probably just showing off. Very socially inappropriate, but not necessarily harmful. A year 1 student using sexually explicit language, and depending on the type of language that was, if it was indicated knowledge above or sexual knowledge above their developmental age, that would be something of great concern. But if it was depends on the teacher and how they understand sexual language. And whether it might be swear words or whether it might be explicit language. A year 1 students putting their own pants down in front of peers. So that's not necessarily developmentally abnormal, but certainly socially inappropriate. When we asked teachers around about their education and what they have done in relation to being trained to identify problematic sexual behaviours and respond appropriately, we found that 80% of them had received some sort of training through courses focused on mandated reporting of child abuse. So in Australia, that's responding to abuse and neglect. In South Australia, that's responding to abuse and neglect. Around about a 6-hour day training package. You can then update that online, which takes around about 2 hours. You cannot get the amount of information required to be able to identify harmful sexual behaviours, respond to them beyond, and most of them just talk about responding to them in relation to reporting rather than what happens when the child keeps coming back to your classroom day after day after day. How do you respond to them and support them? Education training on child protection is quite scarce. We need to include that in our pre-service teacher training. It needs to be beyond, it needs to be course, it needs to be beyond a 6-hour training module that's focused on reporting. We had 43 or 44% of teachers say that they had professional development supplied through the workplace. Then we had teachers find out for themselves by doing some research, probably after being exposed to children or observing children displaying problem sexual behaviours, they have gone and found their own resources, such as reading a book or an internet resource, and looking for professional development that they've sought on their own. Their understanding of harmful sexual behaviour and what it looks like was satisfactory. It was they were able to identify some elements, but they didn't have extensive knowledge. And they didn't feel confident in being able to support children. So when we asked them, what do you need? 89% want specific training. They want to be able to be fully informed in relation to distinguishing between normal and problem sexual behaviours. Most states and territories use the traffic light document in relation to identifying developmentally normal, what's concerning and what's problematic. They want to know how to respond to the school processes. What do they do? What is in place in the school in relation to how they respond. Do they separate their children? Who looks after one child while the other child is taken to a different spot? What do we speak to them? We know that we're not, as teachers, we're not supposed to interview children. But what do we do when they start talking to us? Quite often, if they're in that situation, they want to defend themselves or they want to explain what they've done, why they've done it, etc. Teachers aren't quite sure how to manage that. They want to know what you do with the children involved and the parents. Often when an incident like that occurs, you obviously get parents come up to the school and they need to know and be informed, as well as the general parent community. We know that if anything occurs within a school context and it gets out amongst the parent community, there can be quite a severe backlash. How do teachers respond to that? And how do schools respond to that? They want to know how to educate children and the parent community in protective behaviours and appropriate sexual behaviours. It is a sensitive topic. You have some parents that are quite conservative and think you're going to expose children to something beyond their age, even though we know that education departments would not do that. They certainly would not develop anything that wasn't age appropriate for children. They want to know what they do for themselves in relation to self-care. Some of these incidents can be quite traumatic, not only for the children, but also for the educator involved that might come across them. They want education in the legal context applying to children's problematic sexual behaviours. They certainly don't want to put children out there in a way that's going to be more harmful and lessen their opportunity in getting therapeutical treatments and helping them in their way to recovery. They want training in trauma-informed practice. As we know, most of the children that display problem sexual behaviours are children who come from traumatised backgrounds or adversity. So we need to know how do we support children to develop them holistically. It's our duty of care to not only educate them academically, but also support their holistic development. They want their training to be regular, readily accessible and available when they need it. And of course, we want, educators have said that they want a whole school approach. It needs to be something that's done collaboratively so that educators, principals, school counsellors can all support one another and all understand how to work together. Specifically for children, educators wanted expert counselling at the school level. When asked what was currently in place for children in their schools, a lot of them came back with school counsellors, wellbeing officers, psychologists. However, they were grossly under-resourced in the sense that they might have a wellbeing officer in their school for 2 days a week. So what happens if something like this occurs on one of the other 3 days that the school counsellor isn't there? So they want children to be able to have access to those services whilst they're on their school grounds. They want somebody there on a daily basis. And for larger schools, they may need 2. If you've got schools that have 1,500 children, one school counsellor or wellbeing officer isn't going to be sufficed to accommodate that number of children. They want access to community supports to refer families for help. So educators aren't always informed in relation to to some of the community supports available for children in this space. So they need to be kept up to date in relation to what's available, whether there's waiting lists, who's it for, does it cost anything, all those things, so that they can actually provide that information for their families and for their children. They want access to suitable books and learning materials. So this is books for them, for their learning and understanding, but also books that they can share with children that are age appropriate, that can touch on these things in an age appropriate and non-controversial way, so that it satisfies parents and children are also learning some of the key messages. And of course they want learning materials as well and activities that they can use to educate children around this. They also wanted negotiated education plans, or some called them negotiated education plans, others called them care plans, others called them behaviour management plans. There's multiple different names for these plans, but they needed something specific for that individual child. As we know, there's no one approach that's suitable to all children. We need to make sure that our approach is individualised to meet that child's needs. But most of all, and came through very strong, was they wanted professional collaboration in managing the consequences of problem sexual behaviour with other suitably qualified professionals. One of the things that teachers, they can identify a problem sexual behaviour, they can report that problem sexual behaviour. What do they do then? When the child comes to their school on the Monday, the Tuesday, the Wednesday, in some education settings there has been an SSO, which is a student support officer, that has been had to accompany a child around all day, every day, because this child had quite severe problem sexual behaviours and was engaging in those behaviours and putting other children at risk. So that's quite an expensive strategy to try and support children. So they want strategies, teachers want strategies themselves. They're not expecting to be psychologists or social workers, but they want some of the strategies that psychologists or social workers may give parents, so that when they're at school, they can have that same support that they're getting at home and in their therapy as well. So intervention services in WA, we've got Child Protection Services, Department of Justice, Department of Education, Department of Health, government funded services and private practices. But it's unclear as to what resources they have, their access, whether there's a waiting period, and collaborative approaches and information sharing. To be able to work universally to support children, we need to go across all of these areas so that we have the information so that we can generate support across all areas where children are. I'm going to finish early, I think. Yeah. Okay, so some of the recommendations that comes out of my research was harmful sexual behaviour is often a result of a range of problems of underlying vulnerabilities. So it's commonly children living in university, children who have been abused, parents who may have been abused. There may be domestic violence or alcoholism. There's all sorts of reasons that children may be at risk. So it's not something that we can tackle alone in one particular service. We have to go across multiple services to be able to, and work together to be able to provide specialised support for children. So we need a collaborative approach between families and all sectors involved in supporting the child's recovery or rehabilitation. We know that research has demonstrated that when programs are implemented with children and their families, that there's a much higher success rate. So why not bring in their educators so that educators are informed with the type of strategies that the professionals are giving parents so that we can continue supporting that in a school classroom. We need to identify how to share information in a sensitive and confidential manner with children being at the centre of that. So we need to address the legal and confidentiality issues, but also provide enough information so that we can all work together on the same page to support the child. We need to develop a management or a care plan for children. So having a look at some of the responses, the initial responses to children and the ongoing responses, the early intervention. Children shouldn't be left to have to display severe problem sexual behaviour before they have access to services. During early intervention, we need to manage that across all professionals and sectors. We need to put children's safety at the forefront, the safety of the child who's displaying those behaviours and also the safety of children around that child. And of course, my key thing as an educator is we need to educate children. Some of the education that are available is consent education. It's about informing or educating children around respectful relationships, protective behaviour, so helping them to understand how to protect themselves and how to protect other children and in the way that they interact with other children and having an understanding of wrong and right behaviours, for example, good secrets and bad secrets. We need to help children with their self-regulation. If children are displaying problem sexual behaviours, one way to approach that is to help them with their self-regulation. And we need to help them with their help seeking. If they are displaying problem sexual behaviours or they understand that what they're doing is putting themselves or other people at risk, they need to be able to feel confident enough to be able to reach out for help, and that help should be available to them. And of course, we need further research to find out how we actually best manage this to work in a way that we can cross-collaborate to support the child. Now, recommendations specific for education students. We need training for teachers that is specific to harmful sexual behaviours. We need to build educators' knowledge and their understanding and also their confidence. If they understand what these behaviours are, how to respond to these behaviours beyond just reporting, it will develop their confidence to be able to manage them. We need a protecting behaviours curriculum and consent education. So education for children to learn how to recognise risky behaviours and implement protective behaviours so that they can protect themselves as well as understand how to seek help. This needs to be monitored. In South Australia, for example, we have the Keeping Safe curriculum, and it's mandatory for all schools to teach that. However, it's not monitored. So the Education Department doesn't know how often children might be getting that education. Is it once a week? Is it once a month? At the moment, all they need to do is say that they need to be trained to be able to teach that curriculum, and they need to be teaching that curriculum, but it's not clear how often that curriculum needs to be taught. Again, if we implement that and teachers are trained around protective curriculum or child protection curriculum, they will again build their confidence. Some teachers don't feel confident speaking to children around issues such as problem sexual behaviour. So they may avoid it. So the more that we actually work with teachers to be able to do that, the more opportunity that they get to build their confidence and their knowledge in that space. We need behaviour policies specific to harmful sexual behaviours. So very much like our policy around bullying, we need policy around harmful sexual behaviours, something that's transparent, that parents can access and understand, so that they have an understanding of the role of the school in relation to problem sexual behaviours and are well aware and informed. It's an opportunity to educate parents and inform parents in this space. A procedure manual. How do you actually respond to children who explain problematic sexual behaviours? So you have your initial response to the observation or the disclosure. Documentation. In research in the Royal Commission, one of the failings was the inconsistency in documentation across school sectors and across institutional sectors, and the lack of information, of clear information to be able to provide a clear understanding of what occurred between which children, what ages were there, what was the initial response, what was the monitoring of that. A lot of those record keeping wasn't done effectively. Next steps, what do you do after that? What do you do after you, as I've said several times, when the kids keep coming back to school, how do you continue to support them? Communicating with the parents of the children displaying sexual behaviour, and also the parents of the children who have been exposed or traumatised by that behaviour. We do need to work collaboratively with parents. We do need to keep them informed. We need to be sensitive. It is an area that parents are not going to necessarily take kindly to, or they might feel like you're attacking them or attacking their child. So that's an area that we need to actually address, so that we all know how to actually respond and discuss these things with parents in a professional way that's not going to make them feel uncomfortable. And then what do we do in relation to the school community risk management? We know that if an incident occurs and it gets out to the parent community or other community members, it can be very challenging for the school. It can be very challenging for the child displaying the behaviours, and also for the child or children who may have been traumatised by those behaviours. We often will get stigmatisation and blame, so we need to protect the children. Care plan for the children displaying the sexual behaviour and for the children exposed. That's something that we can work collaboratively in relation to having an individualised plan to know how to continue supporting these children as they're going through your school, and also working with other professionals and being guided by other professionals in relation to what we can do at school to support their recovery or rehabilitation. Internal and accessible support, so that's your wellbeing officers or SSOs, or school counsellors or school psychologists. Children need access to those almost immediately when something like this occurs. They can't be put off until next Monday, because that's when the school counsellor is back. And also resources for parents. A lot of the concerns that teachers have, the schools might have, is some of the conservative attitudes that parents may have because they are not fully informed. So providing resources for parents so they know what you're teaching their children, so they know why you're teaching children that, and that they can see that it's age-appropriate material. We're not going to be introducing children to connotative sex or understanding sexually transmitted diseases in grade 3. We're going to be looking at respectful relationships in those age ranges. Now I'm just going to leave you with, oops, what did I do? Sorry, okay. More drawings. So Frida Briggs, the late emeritus Professor Frida Briggs, during her work, collected quite a library of children's drawings. So when she was in schools, or teachers or parents would contact her about children displaying sexual behaviours. And these are some of the drawings that she discovered that demonstrated children trying to disguise, that were being overlooked by teachers because teachers weren't aware of some of the symbols to look out for. They weren't looking close enough. They weren't looking for penises in children's drawings. It's not until it's actually pointed out to you and you're educated to look for those things if you're seeing children display problem sexual behaviours, that you can actually clearly identify them. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much for your attention and for listening.